Bonjour, merci. It's been a delight to be here, and again, a big thank you to Anthony, Matthias, and Raveen for just an extraordinary week of wonderful hospitality. So as Neo mentioned in his introduction, we're sort of working with three big questions that relate to how to include the preferences of citizens in power-sharing settlements. So first, how do they come to be adopted? Second, how can they be adapted over time? And what might influence a citizen's decision to either endorse or reject a power-sharing settlement? And how are they able to shape the terms of those agreements? And one way, just very quickly, to think about this is to think through sort of three key stages in the life of an agreement. So we know that power-sharing settlements are hard to adopt, right? They often take a very long time, a lot of negotiation to come to an agreement. They have difficulty functioning well, lots of moments where there's stalemate and deadlock, where parties disagree and they don't want to work together. And we know that they're also hard to reform, right? So once you've reached that very difficult agreement, it's hard to adapt it and reform it over time. This often leaves citizens stuck with agreements that no longer serve them, or the end of the agreement might threaten renewed instability or even violence. So each of these three stages are connected. How the agreement is adopted, whether through elite negotiations or through a referendum, will influence how it functions. How it functions or doesn't function will influence how adaptable it is over the long term. So power sharing is a process, not an event. It requires political parties and citizens to commit and recommit and commit again to working together. And that's not always easy, especially over the long term when there's generational turnover in leadership, or when those who were born before the agreement or who were born after the agreement was made come of political age. So with the time I have today, I'll talk a little bit about how some of these connections have played out in the case of Northern Ireland. So why does Northern Ireland need power sharing? We can trace some of the origins of the conflict to the partition of the island of Ireland and the problems of British colonization and empire. So when the British colonized Ireland and then left, they didn't leave all of it. They kept a piece on their way out. So that little part in orange up in the corner becomes, or sort of creates, Northern Ireland. So that's the area that was a majority Protestant area at the time of partition, 1920 or so, with the rest of Ireland being predominantly Catholic. So there are the 32 counties in Ireland. 6 of them become Northern Ireland and remain part of the United Kingdom to this day. So the conflict in Northern Ireland is typically seen as having sort of two sides. A group that we might call Protestant, Unionist, and Loyalist that have a British identity and want to keep Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom. There are 2 main political parties that are Unionist in orientation, or again, wanting to keep the union with the United Kingdom. And again, so Unionists are those who support the union, but are often willing to work with the other side. The Loyalist perspective is a little bit more hardline. Likewise, you have a Catholic, nationalist, Republican community that have an Irish identity and are seeking Irish unity, right? The return of those 6 counties to Ireland. You have 2 political parties there, Sinn Féin and the Social Democratic and Labour Party, again, that sort of mirror images of the Democratic Unionist Party and the Ulster Unionist Party. Increasingly, however, you have a group of people that are often referred to as the neither nors. So they're neither British or neither Unionist or nationalist in orientation. I've got a bit of a question mark there around whether they have a Northern Irish identity. Some do, some don't. But there's an increasing number of political parties that sort of fall into this other category. The Alliance Party, a socialist party called People Before Profits, and a Green Party. So how power sharing came about was over, again, a 30-year period that has sort of been known as the Troubles. More than 3,600 people were killed in this period. About 50,000 were injured. Begins as a civil rights movement for Catholics who were discriminated in terms of their access to political power, in terms of their access to jobs and education and so on. It morphs into organized political violence with the Irish Republican Army on the sort of Republican side. So of those deaths and injuries, about 3/5 were committed by Republican armed groups. Some were committed by loyalist paramilitaries, and you had the British military presence during this period. There are several attempts to get to a power sharing agreement over time. There's a very brief period in the 1970s that falls apart pretty quickly. But it's in the 1990s where you have the election to the peace talks. So you have an election in which the 10 largest parties get a seat at the table to negotiate a peace agreement together with the British and Irish governments, chaired by a US Senator, George Mitchell. So this takes about 2 years and eventually culminates in what becomes the Good Friday Agreement or the Belfast Agreement. That agreement is endorsed in a referendum held, so it's agreed April 10th, 1998. The referendum is held May 22nd. There's a referendum in Northern Ireland and a referendum in the Republic of Ireland with majority support in both cases. So in Northern Ireland, 71% vote in favor of the Good Friday Agreement. Support's much higher in the Irish nationalist community, but you still have majority support for British Unionists as well. And as you can see, the Republic of Ireland was very much in favor of the agreement, 94%. So there's a lot of complicated political institutions here. I won't go into all of the details, but I'm happy to talk about them at any time. Because there's some really interesting institutional innovations here that require nationalists and unionists to work together in government. So you have a first minister and a deputy first minister. They come from typically a nationalist and unionist, or unionist and nationalist. The two positions hold equal power. So they basically have the same powers, but one is a first minister and the other is a deputy first minister. And they need to work together. Likewise, you have a government that includes typically about 5 political parties according to their strength. So the largest party gets the first pick of what ministry, the second largest party gets a pick, and you go through until you run out of portfolios to share. And again, parties have to designate as nationalist, unionist, or other in the legislative assembly. And again, that other group is growing. So the last election saw a big increase in their support, but it's still nationalists and unionists that are the sort of largest parties. Sometimes this has worked well, at other times not so much. So there have been quite a few moments of immobilism. The institutions were suspended from 2003 till 2007, again from 2017 to 2020, and from 2021, and are currently suspended to this day. And so what it has meant has been sort of, when faced with those moments of deadlock where the parties don't agree or where they boycott the institutions, typically what happens is the British and Irish governments will convene high-level talks. They invite all the political parties to come together and try to sort of modify the institutions to get them working together again. There have been 5 such agreements that have come after the Good Friday Agreement: St. Andrews, Hillsborough, and so on and so on. So again, each of these sort of tweaks things just a little bit over time, each dealing with a different sort of sticking point between the political parties. And so what you have now is, again, the suspension of the institutions, in part because the parties have been very deeply divided over Brexit. So the nationalist parties would want it to remain part of the European Union. The largest unionist party wanted to leave. When the vote happened in the UK as a whole, Northern Ireland voted to remain part of the European Union. This has become a big flashpoint between the different parties. And in fact, one of the largest unionist parties is currently boycotting the institutions until they can get a more favorable deal on Brexit and for Northern Ireland. So they're trying to revise the Northern Ireland Protocol. The other major issue is Irish unity. So the Good Friday Agreement has a clause on a principle of consent, so that if a majority of people of Northern Ireland would like to rejoin the Republic of Ireland, they can have a referendum to do so. The timeline for that referendum is not laid out in the Good Friday Agreement, and it can happen when there's a sense that there's a critical mass in support for it, but again, there's no date. That is looking closer and closer, so they're starting to have conversations around whether or not, or when is the right time to hold that referendum. So that's, again, another point of contention between the political parties. So over the last 5 years, you have had more of a suspension of those institutions than you've had them working. In that 2017 to 2020 period, Northern Ireland sets a world record for the longest period of time without a government. They don't get the Guinness Book of World Records because they're not a sovereign territory. That record remains with Belgium, that also has a power sharing agreement. But the question now is whether or not we're starting to see the end of power sharing, given how much time has lapsed without those institutions up and running. So the prospects don't seem very positive at the moment, yet public opinion surveys tell us that citizens continue to recognize the importance of sharing power. They want power sharing to continue, even as they recognize the need to reform it. So in a recent survey, respondents agreed that power sharing is the most appropriate form of government for Northern Ireland. They think it's been good for the region, but it needs to be improved through further reforms. The question, of course, is how? And what reforms will the parties be willing to agree to? And so I don't mean to end on a question mark here. And to be clear, I'm not convinced that we're seeing the end of power sharing. But I'll just conclude by noting that perhaps our project, which will help tap into citizens' preferences in more concrete and direct ways, can help to point to new directions for those reforms for greater functionality of the institutions. So, il est arrêté maintenant, mais peut-être il peut commencer encore. Merci.